Let me just say as well, for myself, my name's Ben. I'm one of the leaders here. If you're here, you're visiting, you're new, a big welcome. We've been talking about spiritual gifts, and this is the idea that we have natural gifts that God has given us, but we also have spiritual gifts that He has blessed us with. And over the last few weeks, we've been trying to get a little bit of an idea around what those could be, what they could look like. We gave out spiritual gifts tests. If you want one and you haven't had one, then you can come and grab me at the end and I'll show you where you can find one of those online. But what we've wanted is for everybody at like a ground level to have a really firm idea around what their spiritual gifts are. And to understand how God has blessed them, because we believe that if you know how He's blessed you, then you'll know why He's blessed you, and you'll have some kind of an idea about what your purpose is and what it is that He wants you to do. I think that God has made us all differently. He's made us all with different abilities, different skills, and He's not done that by accident. It wasn't just like, roll the dice, oh look, you're an introvert. I think God has done it on purpose. And He has made you specifically because He has things that are only for you to be doing. And so by exploring this, I think it's really encouraging, but I think it's really helpful as well to clarify. And so my hope is, at this point in our series, we all have a general idea around what our gifts are. That's my hope. And if you don't, as I said, I'd love to help you discover that. And I was thinking a little bit about when I first started to discover my spiritual gifts. I did a degree in theology, and as part of that, we had to do this really in-depth psychoanalytical test where they discovered like our personality types, and part of it was spiritual gifts. And they told us like way more information than anybody needed to know about themselves. It was like all these different things. I remember coming back, and it said like, what was some of the one? Well, the one that stood out, it was like competitiveness, 10 out of 10. And I was like, nailed it, I won. There was like faithfulness, 1 out of 10. And I was like, the shame. And what it kind of pulled together was this picture of somebody who loves like an adventure, who loves like going for new things, but kind of struggled with fine detail and maintaining things. And in the spiritual gifts section, it talked about leadership, it talked about communication, and it talked about like apostleship, which is like beginning new things or bringing the gospel into new spaces. And I remember sitting down at the end with this guy. I'd never met him before, and he looks at my piece of paper, and he just honestly just looks at me and he said, Ben, you need to slow down or you're going to burn out. And I was like, who are you? Like, why are you saying this, like this kind of firmly in my life? And he said, next thing he said was, have you ever considered church planting? And I was like, you're scaring me. This is really, really weird. And he spent half an hour talking through some of my gifts, talking through some of the challenges of them, and talking through what he felt God had blessed me with. And honestly, it was one of the most powerful conversations in my life. I came out of it really encouraged. I came out of it really excited, and I came out of it with this kind of really focused idea of my purpose and what I should be doing. But I didn't kind of stay in that place. Over the next 6 months, 12 months, I think I started to feel a bit of discomfort with myself, because I realized that as good as I was at winning stuff, that meant that other people were getting annoyed with me, because it's quite hard to be a good friend if you're trying to beat everyone at everything all the time. And I found like my competitiveness was like grating, and I'd get into arguments with people, and I'd be frustrated if I wasn't the center of attention all the time, and it was causing friction with family members, and then I was wanting to stay away from them. And then I was getting annoyed at work because if I wasn't doing a new project all the time and starting something new, I was getting bored and couldn't focus. And I got to this point about a year later where I just didn't like myself anymore. And I remember saying, I'm never going to play board games again because I just don't want to be around myself when I'm in that. And I started playing only co-op board games where we all win or we all lose, because I was like, maybe this will help. I started to try and kind of push against this, starting new things all the time, and said, don't do that. Like, you shouldn't be like that. That's not like a good trait in a person. You need to be more like the faithful type of person. That's what Christians look like. They're the ones who always show up. They're the ones who clean the dishes at the end of the party. Like, that's what you should. So I started pushing against all of my natural traits and my natural gifts, and I started to resent them. And I remember after about 6 to 12 months of this, one day I was just wrestling with this frustration. And I felt that God said to me really clearly that it wasn't the what of my gifts that was the problem, it was the why of my gifts that I was missing. It wasn't that I had the wrong gifts, it wasn't that he'd done something bad when he'd blessed me in the way that it was. But what he was saying is that you've completely missed your purpose. You've completely missed why it is that I have done this way with you. And because you don't have your why right, you're now pushing away the very things that I sowed inside of you for the purpose that I had for you. Does that make sense? And I think that this is a danger for every single one of us. If we don't understand the purpose of our gifts, then we can reject them and say, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to have those things in my life. We can misunderstand them. We can misuse them. I think that 90% of the hurts that I see caused inside churches are people with extreme gifts and yet no understanding of the why behind those gifts. They thought that it was so that they could get a platform. They thought that it was so that they could get a career and some money. They thought that it was so that they could be celebrated and everyone would love them, but that isn't why they got those gifts. And because they didn't know the purpose behind the gift, they end up using the gift for things that they were never intended for, and people get hurt. I think that the why really, really matters. And what I find is fascinating is when I read the letters from Paul to the early church, they were so gifted. Like, they were so gifted. Some of the stories about words of knowledge and prophecies and healings and miracles, apostles going and planting churches everywhere, evangelists bringing thousands to faith. Like, it was incredible. Their gifts were massive, and yet they were completely divisive inside the church as well. They were tearing the church apart because everyone had all of these gifts, and yet they didn't really understand the why behind them. And this is what Paul says. If you've got a Bible, you can find this with me. Somebody's put my Bible. Oh, good. I left the ribbon. I had a moment of quickly, how fast can I find the right passage? I want to look at 1 Corinthians. I'm going to start at the end of chapter 12. I just want to read this through because this is the exact context in which Paul's writing. It's on the screen as well. And we're going to start in verse 29. 1 Corinthians 12, verse 29. And Paul says this: Are we all apostles? Are we all prophets? Are we all teachers? Do we all have the power to do miracles? Do we all have the power of healing? Do we all have the ability to speak in unknown languages? Do we all have the ability to interpret unknown languages? Of course not. Of course not. So he starts by saying, like if you feel frustrated, like you wish that you were a church planter, and that's not how God made you. God made you incredibly pastoral. He made you incredibly kind and loving. It's because he's made us differently on purpose. Of course we don't all have everything. That's not how it works. Otherwise, one person could just go it alone and do it by themselves. We need each other. He says, of course not. But then he says this, and I think that this for me is the key that I just want to keep coming back to today. He says, so you should earnestly desire the most helpful gifts. The most helpful gifts. Like not the gifts that are good for you, the gifts that are helpful for others. He's saying, like, these aren't static, you can get new gifts, but that at the center, desire gifts that are going to be a blessing for other people. So now let me show you a way of life that's best of all. If I could speak in all of the language of earth and of angels, but didn't love others, I'd just be a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I had the gift of prophecy, and I understood all of heaven's secret plans and possessed all knowledge, and if I had such faith that I could move mountains, but I didn't love, I'd be nothing. If I gave everything to the poor, even sacrificed my body. I could boast about it, but if I didn't love others, I would have gained nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It doesn't demand its own way. It's not irritable. It keeps no record of being wronged. It doesn't rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever truth wins out. Love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures every circumstance. See, this is a passage that we read at weddings, and we talk about it in the context of marriage, but Paul wrote it in the context of spiritual gifts in church. He wrote it about how it is that we're supposed to use our gifts in community together. He's saying, look, it's not about you getting ahead faster. It's not about you suddenly having this moment where everything clicks and you go from 0 to 100 like that. He says, if you get this right, it will lead you to being patient. It will lead you to being kind. I remember a story a little while ago about some church leaders, and they were asked to write a sermon about the Good Samaritan, which famously is a story about religious people who don't stop for a homeless guy by the side of the road or a guy who's been beaten up and hurt, and they walk past because they're too busy. And so they're writing this sermon, and then as they go to the conference centre to give the sermon, they place somebody outside who's a homeless guy who is hurting and struggling, and he says, "Can you help me?" And what they found of 40 pastors, only one stopped. Only one stopped. Why? Because they were too busy. They were like, well, I've got to go to the conference centre to give my talk on why we should stop for people. So they didn't stop because they were trying to use their spiritual gifts well. What an irony. Isn't that just the way of it, though, that we start to grow in our faith, and then instead of it making us more patient, instead of it making us slow down, instead of it making us more kind, it can actually do the opposite. We become more proud. We become more in love with ourselves and think wonderfully of ourselves. Whereas Paul's like, no. This should make you more humble. This shouldn't make you envy other people. It shouldn't make you jealous. It shouldn't be something you boast about. The heart of why God has given you spiritual gifts is to love. And I don't know about you, but there's times in my life, particularly as a dad and as a husband, where I feel love and I want to show love, but I don't always know the best way. I mean, especially as my kids are getting towards teenage years, I want them to know that they're loved, but it gets harder. And what Paul says is that God has given you spiritual gifts to show you how to love practically. He has blessed you, so you don't need to make it up. You don't need to work it out. He wants you to use these for love. Why has God blessed you with a gift? To love. And so what does this look like for you? Truth is, I don't know. I don't know, because it looks differently for each and every single one of us. The why is the same, but the what is different. And so what I thought could be quite helpful is to get a couple of other people who could share a little bit about their experience of spiritual gifts, how they discovered theirs, what it is that they have learned throughout this. And so I thought we could do that today, mix it up a little bit. And so I'd love it if you could welcome up Izzy, who's going to come, and I'm going to ask her a few questions. And as you're listening to Izzy, and then we're going to hear from Mark in a minute as well, I'd love for you to be reflecting on how you would answer these questions, how you see this in your life, and what this looks like for you. And I wanted some different people, because you might not resonate with my spiritual gifts. You might look at me and go, the man's weird, I don't get it. And that's fair, that's fine, I am a little bit. But hopefully, you'll resonate a little bit more with Izzy or a little bit more with Mark. Or if not, there's a prayer ministry team at the end and we can work through that. So, Izzy.
Hi.
Is that working?
Hello.
Great. I loved how they welcomed you with such applause and love. And yes, that was...
Thanks, guys.
So, what I would love for us to just discuss and hear a little bit more is maybe to start with, what do you see as being your spiritual gifts, and how did you discover them? How do you know that is your spiritual gifts?
So my spiritual gifts are leadership, hospitality, and the sexiest one, which is administration.
Hey.
I did your quiz, so I worked out that they were definitely them, but I've always known I was a leader. I think it's just this natural thing sometimes for people that from a young age I was a bit bossy, I was quite driven. So that kind of fit that I was a leader. Administration is one of those things that's with time. I wasn't good at administration as a teenager. My parents will tell you that. My timekeeping was terrible. But again, as I've got older, that's something I've learned. And hospitality was something that's actually been really recent. When my husband and I were looking at houses to buy, we had a vision of having a home that we could open to other people and host and have a space where we could fit people in. And we got that. We were blessed with an amazing house that we can do that. And so that's something we've been able to do just in the last few years, and that's been an amazing thing to realise that we love hosting together. He's a really good cook, I'm not, but I love hosting. So it's like, together, that's a great spiritual gifting for us.
Yeah, that's really good. So, what? I guess the question I really want to know is a little bit about how you've been growing in those spiritual gifts and how God has led you to be using them. What does that all look like?
Yeah, so I'm a nurse, and I've been a nurse for about 8 years, and I realised that I love my job, and I realised that I really enjoyed leading, and I enjoyed management as well, because again, those two gifts worked really well together. And I ended up in management at quite a young age, so I was a ward manager by the time I was 24, 25 years old. Don't speak to Angel, because I was her manager for a short time, so she'll tell you a different story. But I really enjoyed management, I enjoyed the challenge. But interestingly, for a long time, I thought I was only a leader outside of church.
Yeah.
I didn't think I was meant to be a leader in any way in church. So I spent all these years doing all this stuff outside of my job and taking on loads of responsibility and challenges, things that actually at points I didn't quite feel ready for at that age, but really felt like God was throughout my career journey, step by step, leading me through it. And yeah, that's been amazing. But it's only really been since we came to Soul City that I've started leading in a church capacity. I was a worship leader before, but since coming here, Johnny and I have led the 20s to 30s, we've led a small group, and hosted the small group. So that's been a recent thing of learning that actually leading doesn't just have to be in one capacity, it doesn't have to be just outside church, you can do both, and it can look different, and that's been a great learning curve.
That's really good. And I think actually it's something a lot of people experience is all the stuff outside the church, and then you come to church and it's not the same, or maybe you just don't feel like you've got permission to do that or whatever. What turned that corner for you? How did that happen? Like what made that difference at then?
You asked us.
I asked. So somebody asking you directly.
Yeah.
We'd
barely been at Soul City that long, and Ben literally was like, "You two, will you do the 20s to 30s?" And we were like, "Okay." But that was really interesting because we'd not long been at the church, but you saw something in us, or you saw the potential, and it was like, okay. At the beginning, all I did was kind of organise events. So it felt like more of an administration thing, but actually with time, it felt more like, no, there's more to this. When you're leading a group of people, you have influence, and there's something you can do to try and encourage people and to grow that. But it was because you asked.
Yeah, but that is a really good principle, because I can't ask everybody. But I've got a friend called Patrick, and he says that the four most powerful letters in the world are I-C-N-U. I-C-N-U. And I think that there is something powerful about us as a community looking to one another and saying, hey, I see this in you. You are incredible at encouragement. I see this in you. You think you're bossy, but you're actually a leader. I see this in you. You've got a gift here. And we can actually call that out of each other. And I think so often, we're the last people to see the gifts that we've got, and everyone around us can see it. And so having that proactivity to say, I see it in you, I think is really encouraging for each other. So one last question, which is, If there are other people with similar gifts, what has God been teaching you? What would you want to say to help them? Or general big question of how's God using this?
Yeah, so I want to talk about something specific actually, which God's really been talking to me about for the last 6 months. So before we came to Soul City, I was at Ivy for 10 years, and about half that time I was a worship leader. And I really enjoyed it, but I also found it really challenging, and I ended up getting quite burnt out from doing it. And then in the last 6 months I've been really reflecting on that, why did that happen? And I felt God highlight the fact that I was trying to lead, or I was trying to do spiritual gifting from a place of insecurity. So I didn't have my identity aligned to what it should have been. And because I was trying to be a worship leader from a place of insecurity, I got burnt out because I was giving into anxiety every time, and I was coming away focusing on all the things I did wrong. And I was making it about talent. And talent's great, talent's a good thing, it's amazing. But talent isn't what makes a good worship leader. A good worship leader it's the gifting. And when you take spiritual gifting away from being a worship leader, what that leaves is just performance. Yeah. And so that's then really hard because you are focusing on all the mistakes you made. Like even this morning, forgetting the melody halfway through the song, 3 years ago, that would have broken me. Yeah. And I would have come home and I probably would have cried. I would have really beaten myself up for it, and I would have felt like a failure because I got that wrong. But now, I'm trying to lead out of a different place. I'm trying not to lead out of a place of insecurity. Yeah. But I just want to share a really short story, if that's okay. And it's not one I'm proud of. But when I was a worship leader at Ivy, a new girl came who was called Elle. She was younger than me. She was amazing. She was so encouraging and kind. And she was a worship leader. She had an amazing voice. And I hated her. But not really. But because I was so insecure, my response to her, I realise now, I didn't do it consciously. But I didn't want to encourage her. Because I was insecure, I didn't want her to be even better than what she already was. And I withheld encouragement from her. And years later, we had a mutual friend who said to me, Elle was telling me the funniest thing the other day. She said that when she first came to church, she was really intimidated by you because of what kind of a worship leader you were, because of who you were. And she recognised that she was intimidated by you. And so what she did to try and combat that is she wanted to champion you. So she did the complete opposite thing to what I did. And I realise now why she was always so kind to me and so encouraging to me, is because she was championing me. And when I got told that, I was humbled. That was so wow, we totally were leading from a different place. Yeah. So her response was to champion my spiritual gifting and wanted to see me do better, whereas mine had been the opposite. And I'll just end with a quote that I don't know who said it, but it's about leading from a place of significance, not for a place of significance. It's good. It's really good. So it really matters, who you know that you are, who you're called to be, what your spiritual gifting is, but that your humanness is important, and it's okay to make mistakes and forget melodies. But that's how God uses you, and that's how it's a spiritual gifting, because of your humanness, and it's not about insecurity, it's about gifting.
Well, we thank Izzy so much. That was a mic drop moment, wasn't it? But isn't that exactly what Paul was saying? He's saying love is kind, love is patient, it's not envious, it doesn't boast. I think that's the security piece, isn't it? When you're secure, you're serving and you're blessing other people for their sake. And when you're insecure, you're serving and you're blessing people for your own sake. And that's vital that we get that right, to be a healthy community who are blessing people in the right way. So the first purpose of our spiritual gifts is to love. The second one is to build one another up to maturity, that we would become mature people. Ephesians chapter 4, which I've got on the screen as well, verse 11, it says this: "Now these are the gifts Christ gave to the church apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors and teachers. Their responsibility is to equip God's people to do his work and build up the church, the body of Christ. This will continue until we've all come to such unity in our faith, that's the love bit, and knowledge of God's Son, that we will be mature in the Lord. The word equipped, if there's any doctors in the room, that word in the Greek literally means when you've got a broken bone and you reset the break. It's describing something which was meant to be strong, but is now in a place of brokenness. It's fractured. It cannot hold the weight. It is hurting. It is painful. And what Paul is saying in this passage is that there has to be a resetting of ourselves so that we can build one another up to maturity. And we've all been around adults who act like children, haven't we? Who, again, they think about themselves. They don't take on any responsibility. It's me, all the time. And Paul says that's not what it's supposed to be. Our spiritual gifts have a purpose. They're to love, but they're also to strengthen us. That we would be spiritually mature people, not like spiritual infants who need other people to look after us all the time. We would take responsibility for ourselves and we would serve one another. Amazing. I'd love it if we could hear a little bit of Mark's story. Could we give Mark a round of applause as he comes up? Good morning, Mark.
Morning.
Similar kind of question. I'd love to just start by hearing a little bit about how you see your spiritual gifts and how you discovered them, why you think what you think your spiritual gifts are your spiritual gifts. That question.
Sounds good. Okay. So I did the test as well, partly because I was going to be asked about it. So my encouragement is if you haven't done it, go away and do it, whatever the reason.
Otherwise you might be asked next week to...
But it's so helpful and really, really insightful. So really, really encouraged. So my gifts that came out of that test were very similar, actually. So leadership, written down so I didn't forget. Leadership, hospitality, service, exhortation, and administration were the top ones. And I think it's really good to do it because the more you're self-aware of your own sort of gifts, even if you know them, it can kind of encourage you or remind you. So hospitality, similarly, is a bit of a strange one for me because it's like I'm not necessarily keen to be a host, but actually when you looked at the questions, it's all about people, and I do love people, and maybe I'd lost sight of that at times. So sometimes it's just helpful to trigger. But the second part is that I guess I think the spiritual gifts are really important, but there's so many other gifts that we have and talents that we can give to God. And so I work for DHL, and I'm a business improvement manager. So a lot of my gifts and talents are in data, in trends analysis, challenging assumptions, graphs. Like those are all the things that really empower me. So those are kind of and how I found out those is just obviously I've been working for 10 years with it. So if it wasn't the right place, then that's
Yeah, really good. So how have you seen God use those gifts, or how have you decided to use those gifts for a purpose beyond yourself? What does that look like?
So the question on how I decided to use them was very much, it's been a long burn thing, probably over like a year and a half, where in part I've been trying to move away from working fully for DHL and trying to think about how I can use my time differently. So I've actually moved from working 40 hours to 32 hours, hopefully continuing that trajectory. I don't know, we'll see. But the point was to be able to create space, and that was important for me, to be able to use my gifts and talents in other ways than just for my job. So that's kind of one of the questions. And I think in terms of how I've used the gifts for, particularly for Soul City, and we have these discussions all the time, is I guess my brain really works on this kind of facts and feelings differentiation. So when I think about, I went to this conference with some guys from the leadership team at Launch, and we had one of the speakers was sharing about this survey And it just struck me that actually in Christian settings, we often actually don't kind of get a presentation that has graphs and facts and figures. And I actually found that really empowering. And I was like, yeah, that's amazing. And it feeds to my mindset of facts. So, over the last year or so, I've been really trying to work with the leadership team on how we can think about all the important things along that are factual based. And what I mean by that, the example I'd give is if you go to a doctor and you've got something wrong with you and you want them to fix you or help you, well, they often take your vital signs, right? They take your blood pressure or your heart rate or your height or your weight, all these factors, right? And then they take all of that and they try and give you the best possible sort of decision or medicine or whatever. And if you took that away, you said, oh no, the doctors, you can't have that information, you can't have their weight, their blood type or whatever, all these characteristics. Well, the doctor can try really hard and can make a genuine best guess at how to fix you. But they're kind of inhibited because they don't have the information they need. So what I'm trying to help our leadership team and help the church do is go, well, what are those vital signs? What are those facts and figures that will help us make kind of the best decisions for church? So.
Yeah, and I really love that because I think so often we think if we don't look like enter Christian celebrity here, then there's not ministry. Or we think if I want to have a ministry, if I want to serve God, I have to make myself look more like that person. Which is again exactly what Paul was saying. Are we all apostles? Are we all prophets? And I love that Mark has looked and he's not gone, how do I become more like Ben? Thank you, Jesus. He said, how do I use what God has given me to build his kingdom and to bless people and to serve people? And honestly, for us in this church, it makes such a difference. It makes our church so much healthier to have people like Mark coming and saying, well, let's look at, I love your ideas, Ben, but let's look at some facts. Let's look at where things are actually up to, and that gives just a completely different way of doing church. So, again, last question, which gives you the opportunity for any catch-all that you want to throw in there, but there's definitely other people who are similar to you with similar gifts, or maybe completely different gifts, but they're thinking through how they use them. What would you say that you've learned, or what would you want to say to help other people as they're looking to grow, develop, and to use their gifts for the best purpose?
So I'll answer that with a little bit of a story that covers something else you're mentioning. So just going back to this kind of launch training day, I actually felt very much like I didn't fit into the actual event itself. Halfway through, I felt very unqualified and the wrong person, because actually a lot of the Christian leaders that were there were excellent communicators. They were excellent teachers. They had gifts of prayer. They had gifts of leading worship, and that wasn't me. And I actually felt really, really kind of lost in that place. And it was actually this particular lady who brought this kind of survey and this other piece that kind of reminded me that there's other expressions of leading in a church that aren't those particular ways. And I think that was really important, and it's the same as what Izzy was saying, same as what you were saying before there, about finding who you are, because you will connect better with Jesus as well, and what you're called to do. You'll be more natural, like don't try and be someone else, or don't try and follow after these things. Understand who you are, and Jesus loves that. He really, really does, and he built you like that, not to be like someone else. He built you to be like yourself, so seek after that. And I think the point of that, and to answer your question about what you should do with it, once you've really kind of articulated what you think your gifts are or where you can serve, is really trying to find like-minded people. It's kind of the only kind of suggestion. So this lady really helped me, because I connected with somebody that actually looked at the world in the same way I look, and that's really, really helpful. Obviously, it's great to have diversity and different viewpoints, but finding some people like yourself is really helpful. So I don't really know what more advice to give other than do that. And if you have similar giftings, then I'd love to talk to you, because I'm trying to understand that as well. Understand my place as a kind of a different-minded person to a conventional, say, pastor, leader, or whatever.
Yeah. Really love it. Can we thank Mark for sharing?
Thank you.
hope that this is helpful for you. I find it helpful and I find it encouraging because God doesn't make mistakes. God has invested in you and he has blessed you. And he's blessed you for a purpose. And I love that idea that it doesn't matter how far you are on your Christian walk either. You can be a Christian for a week and there's somebody who's been a Christian for 5 days walking behind you. But it doesn't matter how spiritually mature you even feel you are. We can all love. We can all use the gifts that we've got to bless other people. We can all use the gifts that we've got to help other people become stronger in their faith, to walk closer to Jesus, to take bolder risks where they need to, and to stand alongside each other. And I think that a healthy church is a church where everyone knows their gifts and they're using them to bless one another. So I'm going to invite the band up. We're going to wrap up and we're going to go into a time of worship. But just before we do, I'd love to take a moment just where we are. Maybe just if you're able to, just pause and close your eyes. And I'd love to take a moment to reflect on what gifts has God given you. I sometimes think about the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And this boy comes to Jesus and he's like, I've not got much, but I've got a little bit of bread and I've got a little bit of fish. And he gives that to Jesus. And then Jesus uses the little that he had to feed thousands. He does the miracle with the ordinary situation. And my question for you, if you were to look down in your hands, what would be the little bit of bread and the little bit of fish that you've got? And are you willing to give those to Jesus? And are you willing to say, Lord, I might not fit the mold of other Christian leaders. I'm built this way. I'm a hospitality person. I'm an encourager. I'm an administrator. I'm a communicator. I'm an inviter. That this is me. And even if it doesn't seem like much, what if you just took a moment today to give that to Jesus and to entrust it to him and to say, Lord, use this. Lord, use me. I give you my everything. And that might feel big, it might feel small. And I'd love it, before we finish, for you to just take a moment to reflect and ask God, are you calling me to activity? Are you calling me to use my gifts in a way, in a new way, in a new season, or to continue using my gifts and to develop them? But what are you calling me to do with what you've given me? And I leave that between you and Jesus. That's for you to talk through with God. But I believe that your best life, I believe that your most fulfilled life, I believe that your happiest life, most purpose-filled life, lives on the other side of you using your gifts for love, to bless and support other people. And Lord, thank you that you have given us these gifts. Thank you that you've blessed us. Before we've done anything, you've blessed us. And Lord, help us to see something of our purpose, something of our why, through what you've placed in our hands. Let us not miss this. Let us not be distracted from this. Let us not go through life and look back with regret, but Lord, lead us into lives of fruitfulness, lives of love, lives that are spiritually mature as a community, we pray.